The homeless teacher's secret. There are moments when dignity becomes a performance, when respectability requires a costume, and when the distance between how we appear and how we live becomes a chasm that threatens to swallow us whole. Sometimes that performance is so perfect, so carefully maintained, that even the performer begins to forget where the act ends and the truth begins. The Family Feud studio buzzed with its familiar pre-show energy, bathed in the warm cascade of blue and gold lights that had illuminated thousands of dreams, celebrations, and unexpected revelations. Steve Harvey stood at center stage adjusting his burgundy tie, his movements carrying the practiced confidence of a man who had made this ritual his own through years of dedication to his craft. It was Thursday afternoon in Los Angeles, and the energy felt particularly vibrant today. In the audience, teachers from across the country had gathered for another special Educators Week episode, their faces bright with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from people who have dedicated their lives to shaping young minds and rarely get recognition for the magnitude of their contribution to society. They carried themselves with the easy confidence of people accustomed to being in front of groups, comfortable with attention, natural at engaging an audience. On the left side of the stage stood the Williams family from Detroit, Michigan, 5 generations of educators, ranging from kindergarten teachers to university professors, representing nearly 2 centuries of combined classroom experience. Everything about his appearance suggested prosperity, professionalism, and the kind of stability that parents look for when entrusting their children to an educator. On the right side stood the Anderson family from Sacramento, California, and at their center was a man who had spent the last 2 years perfecting the art of appearing successful, while living a reality that would shock anyone who knew him professionally. James Anderson stood third from the left at his family's podium, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that looked like it had come straight from a high-end department store. His crisp white shirt was pressed to perfection, his silk tie was knotted with mathematical precision, and his black leather shoes were polished to a mirror shine that reflected the studio lights. At 42 years old, James had the bearing of someone who commanded respect in every room he entered. His salt and pepper beard was trimmed with meticulous care. His posture spoke of confidence earned through years of standing in front of classrooms, and his smile carried the warmth that had made him beloved by students, parents, and colleagues throughout his 20-year teaching career. What no one in that studio could see, what no one in James's professional life knew, was that he had been living in his 2015 Honda Civic for the past 2 years. The transformation from respected high school mathematics teacher to homeless man living in his car had happened gradually, then suddenly, the way financial catastrophes often do. It had started with his divorce 3 years earlier, a painful end to a 15-year marriage that had left James emotionally devastated and financially gutted. For months, James had juggled credit cards and personal loans, borrowed against his retirement fund, and picked up every tutoring opportunity he could find. He'd worked as a wedding photographer on weekends, delivered food on school nights, and sold everything he owned of value: his father's watch, his mother's jewelry, even his prized collection of first-edition mathematics textbooks. The divorce settlement had been fair in theory but crushing in practice. James had kept the house initially, but the mortgage payments on a teacher's salary, combined with alimony and child support for his 2 children who lived with his ex-wife in Oregon, had proven mathematically impossible to sustain. But the numbers simply didn't work. On a teacher's salary of $48,000 per year in one of the most expensive housing markets in the country, even the smallest apartment was beyond his reach after all his other obligations were met. The night James had loaded his essential belongings into his Honda and left his house keys on the kitchen counter had been the lowest point of his life. He'd sat in that empty driveway for 3 hours, crying for the life he'd lost and terrified of the uncertain future ahead of him. But most remarkably, it had been 2 years of maintaining the illusion that everything in his life was perfectly normal. That was 2 years ago. 2 years of sleeping in his car, rotating between different parking lots to avoid drawing attention. 2 years of showering at the 24-hour gym where he maintained a membership specifically for that purpose. 2 years of washing his clothes at laundromats and ironing his shirts in the cramped back seat of his car. James had become a master of performance. Every morning, he would wake up at 5 a.m. in whatever parking lot had served as his bedroom the night before, usually behind a Walmart or in a church parking lot, where overnight stays were tolerated. He would drive to Planet Fitness, where his $10 monthly membership gave him access to showers, and begin the careful ritual of transformation. He kept his teaching wardrobe hanging in protective garment bags in his back seat, rotating between 5 suits that he'd managed to save from his previous life. Each morning, he would select the day's outfit with the same care actor might choose a costume, ensuring that every detail projected success and stability. His morning routine was choreographed with military precision. Shower, shave, style his hair, dress in clothes that cost more than most people spent on a week's worth of meals. By 6:30 a.m., James Anderson, the homeless man, had disappeared completely, replaced by Mr. Anderson, the respected mathematics teacher. His classroom had become his office, his sanctuary, the one place where he could maintain the identity he'd built over 2 decades of teaching. At Roosevelt High School, James was known as one of the most dedicated educators on staff. He arrived early and stayed late, not because he was particularly passionate about grading papers, but because he had nowhere else to go. Students loved him. Parents respected him. Colleagues admired his dedication. The principal frequently held him up as an example of excellence in education. James had won 3 teaching awards in the past 2 years. Ironically, the most successful period of his professional life, even as his personal life had completely collapsed. He knew every child's name, their learning style, their family situation, their dreams and struggles. He tutored students for free after school because he literally had nothing else to do with his time. The cruel irony was that James's homelessness had actually made him a better teacher. With no distractions at home, no television or social media or household chores competing for his attention, he could focus entirely on his students. None of them knew that their most successful teacher was sleeping in a car. His calculus classes had the highest test scores in the district. His algebra students were winning math competitions. Parents were requesting that their children be placed in Mr. Anderson's classes. The school board had even discussed promoting him to department head. James had become extraordinarily skilled at hiding his situation. He developed strategies for every aspect of maintaining his secret. He had a post office box for his mail, a different address he used for school paperwork. He kept toiletries and a change of clothes in his classroom closet. He ate lunch in his classroom every day, not because he preferred solitude, but because he couldn't afford to eat out with his colleagues. The most difficult part wasn't the physical discomfort of sleeping in a car, or the constant worry about where he would park safely each night. The hardest part was the isolation, the bone-deep loneliness that came from living a complete lie every single day. When teachers invited him to social gatherings, he always had an excuse: grading to catch up on, a tutoring session to prepare for, a family obligation in another city. He'd become expert at deflecting questions about his personal life, redirecting conversations back to work, maintaining friendly professional relationships without allowing anyone to get close enough to discover his secret. The Family Feud application had come through the school's employee newsletter, an invitation for families to apply for Educator's Week with the chance to win money that could make a real difference in their lives. James couldn't share his struggles with anyone. He couldn't tell his colleagues that he was living in his car because it would destroy his professional reputation and likely cost him his job. He couldn't tell his family because they were already struggling financially and couldn't help him even if they wanted to. He couldn't tell his ex-wife because it might affect his custody arrangements with his children. So James carried his secret alone, maintaining his performance with the dedication of someone who understood that his survival depended on never letting the mask slip. Now, standing on that bright stage with cameras rolling and an audience cheering, James felt the familiar weight of his performance. He smiled when Steve Harvey made jokes. He celebrated when his family gave good answers. He played the part of the successful teacher living the American dream. She'd convinced their cousins to join them, creating the Anderson family team with James as the featured educator. They had no idea that the $20,000 grand prize represented more than just fun money to James. It represented the possibility of getting an apartment, of having a home again, of sleeping in a real bed for the first time in 2 years. James's sister had been trying to get him to do something fun, something to break him out of what she saw as a post-divorce depression that he couldn't seem to shake. Steve Harvey had been particularly charming during the family introductions, spending extra time talking to James about his teaching career, and making sure the audience understood they were in the presence of an award-winning educator who was making a difference in young people's lives. But underneath the perfectly pressed suit and confident smile, James was calculating. $20,000 would be enough for a Dasset and several months' rent on a small apartment. It would be enough to stop living in his car, to have a home address again, to sleep without constantly worrying about whether someone would knock on his window in the middle of the night. The game had progressed smoothly through the first 3 rounds. The Anderson family was holding their own against the Williams family, with James contributing solid answers drawn from his years of teaching experience and his natural aptitude for understanding how survey questions might be answered by the general public. "Mr. Anderson," Steve had said, 20 years of teaching mathematics. That's not just a job, that's a calling. You're shaping the future of America, one student at a time." James had smiled and thanked him, but something in his expression, a flicker of deep tiredness behind his profession demeanor, had caught Steve's attention. There was something about this man that suggested more complexity than the successful teacher narrative implied. Now, as they entered the 4th round, Steve announced the category that would strip away 2 years of carefully maintained pretense. "All right, Anderson family," Steve said, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had endeared him to millions of viewers. "This one's specifically for our educators. Top 7 answers on the board." The studio lights seemed to intensify as Steve opened his card, and James felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The bright lights always reminded him of the overhead fluorescents in his classroom, the place where he could be himself, where his performance was authentic, because teaching was the one part of his life that remained true. "We asked 100 people," Steve announced, "what's a secret a teacher might keep from their students?" But for James Anderson, it was like being asked to confess the central deception of his life in front of millions of strangers. It was such a logical Family Feud question for Educators Week. The kind of thing that should have generated answers like their first name or how much money they make, or that they don't know everything. The kind of question designed to gently tease the professional boundaries that teachers maintain while acknowledging their humanity. His sister stepped up to the buzzer first, her face bright with confidence. "That they make mistakes too," she announced cheerfully. His cousin went next. "Their personal problems," she called out, and James's heart nearly stopped. The board lit up. Number 3 answer, worth 22 points. The Anderson family cheered, and James forced himself to smile and clap along with them, even as the irony of the answer cut through him. His entire life had become one massive mistake that he was desperately trying to hide. "That they make mistakes," Steve repeated approvingly. "Good answer," survey says. Number 5 on the board, 15 points. Another celebration from the Anderson family. Another forced smile from James as he contemplated how close that answer came to his own reality. "Personal problems," Steve said. Survey says. They continued building their lead with answers like, "They don't like certain students, and they're learning too." Each response a reminder of the professional boundaries James maintained, the careful separation between his public and private selves. Steve's tone was light, conversational, but James could feel the weight of the question settling over him like a heavy blanket. His throat felt dry, his hands were starting to shake slightly, and he could feel sweat beginning to form under his perfectly pressed shirt. "James," Steve said, and something in the host's voice was different now. More personal, more attentive. "Mr. Anderson, 20 years in the classroom. I bet you've got some secrets. When his turn came, James approached the buzzer like he was walking toward the edge of a cliff. 2 years of living a lie had taught him to be constantly vigilant, constantly careful, constantly aware that one slip could destroy everything he'd worked to maintain. What's a secret a teacher might keep from their students? Steve asked gently. He thought about his students, brilliant kids who looked up to him, who came to him for advice about college and careers and life decisions. Kids who saw him as successful, stable, someone who had figured out how to navigate the adult world with dignity and grace. James stared at the board, but the words were blurring together. In his mind, he could see his Honda Civic parked behind the Walmart, where he'd slept the night before, could feel the ache in his back from sleeping on a car seat for the 1,000th time, could remember the humiliation of brushing his teeth in a gas station bathroom at 5:30 that morning. What would they think if they knew their math teacher was homeless? What would their parents think? What would his colleagues think? What would happen to his career, his reputation, his carefully constructed professional life? Steve's expression shifted slightly. He'd been expecting something more specific, something that would generate laughs and keep the energy of the game moving. But something in James's tone, something in the way he delivered that response, made the host pause. "That we don't have all the answers," James said quietly, his voice barely audible over the studio's ambient noise. "That we don't have all the answers," Steve repeated slowly. "Survey says." Instead, Steve found himself studying James's face more carefully. The answer wasn't on the board. Normally, this would be the moment for Steve to offer gentle consolation and move on to the opposing family. The game would continue, the energy would build, and everyone would focus on the next question. "You all right, Mr. Anderson?" Steve asked gently, his voice carrying genuine concern. There was something in the man's expression that went beyond the usual nervousness of being on television. Something that spoke of burdens carried, of secrets maintained, of a weight that went far beyond the playful premise of the question he'd just asked. That's when 2 years of carefully maintained composure began to crack. James looked up at Steve Harvey, and for the first time in months, he found himself looking into the eyes of someone who seemed to see past the performance he'd been giving. Someone who recognized that there might be more to his story than the successful teacher narrative suggested. Steve's expression shifted completely. The game show host persona fell away, replaced by something deeper, more paternal. He'd interviewed thousands of people over his career, and he'd developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone was carrying more than they were saying. "I'm trying to be," James said, his voice trembling slightly with the strain of holding everything together. Behind the scenes, producers were frantically whispering into their headsets, trying to figure out how to handle this unexpected development. The Williams family stood quietly at their podium, sensing that something significant was happening, but uncertain whether they should intervene or give the moment space. "What's going on?" Steve asked quietly, stepping closer to James at the podium. "Talk to me." James's family members watched him with growing concern, seeing something in his expression that they'd never seen before, a kind of vulnerability that the composed, professional James had never allowed them to witness. He'd never imagined it happening on national television, under bright lights, with hundreds of strangers watching and millions more who would see it later. James started, then stopped. He'd practiced this moment in his mind countless times, imagining how he would eventually tell people about his situation when he finally found a way out of it. But he'd always pictured it happening in private, when he could control the environment and the reactions. But looking at Steve Harvey's face, seeing the genuine concern there, the invitation to trust him with whatever truth he was carrying, James felt something break open inside his chest. 2 years of carrying this secret alone had been slowly suffocating him, and suddenly he needed to breathe more than he needed to protect his professional image. But when it did, a profound silence fell over the studio that was different from any quiet they'd experienced during a taping. "I don't have all the answers," he said again, his voice stronger now but thick with emotion. I don't even have a home. The words fell into the studio like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond their point of impact. The audience didn't gasp immediately. The confession took a moment to register, to settle into understanding. "What do you mean you don't have a home?" Steve asked gently, his voice carrying the kind of careful concern that comes from someone who understands that some questions can shatter whatever composure a person has left. Steve Harvey, who had built his career on having the right words for every situation, found himself momentarily speechless. Behind him, the Williams family exchanged glances of shock and confusion. In the audience, people began to lean forward, trying to process what they'd just heard. James took a shaky breath, looking around the studio, at all the faces watching him, all the cameras recording this moment that would expose his secret to the world. But something about Steve's expression, the complete absence of judgment, the genuine desire to understand, gave him the courage to continue. The studio erupted in a kind of controlled chaos. Gasps from the audience, murmurs of disbelief, the sound of people trying to process information that challenged everything they thought they understood about success and respectability. "I mean, I've been living in my car for 2 years, he said, and the admission hung in the air like a prayer spoken in a sacred space. "I'm a homeless high school teacher, and my students have no idea." Steve stepped closer to James, his movement both protective and supportive. "Hold on," he said, raising his hand to signal for quiet. "Hold on just a minute here." The studio began to settle, but the energy had completely transformed. This was no longer a game show about winning money and celebrating families. This had become something else entirely, a moment of profound human revelation happening in the most public possible space. "James," Steve said softly, "help me understand this. You're a teacher. You have a job. How are you homeless?" James looked at his family members, who were staring at him with expressions of shock and dawning understanding. His sister's hand was over her mouth, her eyes wide with the realization that her brother had been struggling in ways she'd never imagined. He paused, gathering the courage to reveal the full scope of his situation. "Teaching doesn't pay enough," James said simply, his voice carrying the weight of a truth that thousands of educators across the country would recognize. "Not in California, not after a divorce, not with child support and alimony, not with the cost of rent in Sacramento. I make $48,000 a year teaching high school mathematics. After taxes, after my obligations to my ex-wife and children, after car payments and insurance and basic necessities, there's nothing left for housing, nothing." "So where do you sleep?" Steve asked, his voice gentle, but insistent on understanding the full scope of what James was describing. Steve's expression showed a mixture of disbelief and growing anger, not at James but at a system that could force someone who was educating children to live in such circumstances. "In my car," James said, his voice breaking slightly. "Behind Walmart, in church parking lots, anywhere they don't mind if you stay overnight. I shower at the gym. I keep my teaching clothes hanging in my back seat. And every morning I transform myself from a homeless man into Mr. Anderson, the respected mathematics teacher." The audience was completely silent now, processing the magnitude of what they were hearing. This wasn't just a story about homelessness. This was a story about someone they'd been trained to see as successful, someone whose profession commanded respect, living in circumstances that challenged every assumption they had about how the world worked. "Your students don't know?" Steve asked. "Nobody knows," James said, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "I eat lunch in my Calivoom every day, not because I prefer solitude, but because I can't afford to eat out with my colleagues. I decline social invitations, because I can't explain why I can't invite people to my home. I've been living a complete lie for 2 years." Steve turned to address the audience and the cameras, his expression serious in a way his viewers rarely saw. Steve Harvey walked around his podium to stand directly in front of James, abandoning his position as game show host to become something more important. A human being witnessing another human being's pain and choosing to respond with compassion rather than entertainment. Steve Harvey walked around his podium to stand directly in front of James, abandoning his position as game show host to become something more important. A human being witnessing another human being's pain and choosing to respond with compassion rather than entertainment. James, he said, his voice carrying across the studio with quiet authority. What you're describing isn't just about housing. This is about dignity. This is about a society that claims to value education but doesn't pay educators enough to afford basic necessities.